The New Mexico territory baked under a late summer sun that offered no mercy. It was a hard, flinty light that bleached the color from the sky and cracked the earth into a mosaic of thirst. The wind, when it stirred, did little more than move the heat around, whispering through scorched grama grass and carrying the fine red dust that settled on everything, tasting of grit and endings. For Ada Whitmore, the dust was a shroud. It clung to the sweat on her brow, coated her cracked lips, and worked its way into the frayed hem of her gray skirt. For 3 days, she had walked toward the rumor of a creek, a thin line of green on a map drawn from a dying man's memory. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 6 months, taken by a fever that burned as hot as this sun, and now she was a widow twice over, once by God's hand, and once by man's law. The poster would say she'd murdered Mr. Blackwood, the rancher she'd worked for. It would not say he'd had hands like traps, and a breath that smelled of whiskey and rot. It would not say her pistol had bucked in her hand only when his grip had become a vice on her soul. The weight of that Colt Peacemaker, tucked deep in a pocket sewn inside her skirt, was a constant, heavy reminder. It was the tool of her damnation and her only key to survival. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, but fear was a sharper pain, a spur in her side that kept her moving long after her muscles had begun to scream. Then she saw it, not the creek itself, but the promise of it, a straggling line of cottonwoods, their leaves a dusty, tired green. Hope, a thing she'd thought buried with Thomas, flickered painfully in her chest. She stumbled down a shallow arroyo, her worn boots sliding on loose rock, and pushed through a stand of willow. The creek was there, more a trickle than a torrent, but the water was clear, sliding over smooth, sun-warmed stones. She fell to her knees, heedless of the mud, and drank until her stomach cramped. Lifting her head, she saw the cabin. It was set back from the bank, nestled against a low mesa, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with dried mud that was crumbling in places. The roof sagged, a stone chimney listed to one side, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. It looked abandoned, a husk left behind by people who had either died or had the good sense to move on. For Ada, it was a miracle, a roof, walls to keep out the wind and the things that hunted in the night. She approached with the caution of a spooked doe, her hand instinctively going to the heavy lump of the Colt in her pocket. The plank door hung crooked on one leather hinge. There was no fresh sign of man or beast, no tracks in the dust save for the delicate prints of a roadrunner. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she pulled the heavy door open. It groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast silence. The inside was one small room, dim and smelling of dust, cold ash, and the faint, lingering scent of mice. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rickety table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a narrow cot was pushed against the far wall. Light filtered through the grimy window pane and the gaps in the roof. It was perfect. She could rest for a day, maybe 2, gather her strength before pushing north. She let the door swing shut behind her, plunging the room into deeper shadow. And in that sudden quiet, she heard it. A noise. It came from a doorway behind the hearth, one she hadn't noticed, which was covered by a stained canvas sheet. It was a soft sound, a slosh of water followed by a muffled grunt. Her blood ran cold. A bobcat, maybe, or a coyote denning up for the day. Her hand closed around the walnut grip of the Colt. She pulled it free, the oiled click of the hammer being drawn back, a small, deadly prayer in the gloom. She held it with both hands, the long barrel steady, and crept toward the canvas curtain. Whatever was in there, it wouldn't take her without a fight. She used the barrel of the pistol to nudge the canvas aside. The room beyond was a small lean-to, barely big enough for the wooden tub that sat on the dirt floor. Steam, smelling of soap and clean sweat, rose in the close air, catching the slivers of light from the main room. and standing up out of that tub was a man. He was tall, built of long, hard muscle, with shoulders wide enough to block the light. His back was to her, a map of old scars and sun-darkened skin. Water dripped from the ends of his dark, wet hair and traced paths down his spine. He was stark naked. Ada froze, her mind a perfect, screaming blank. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The man reached for a length of cloth on a nearby crate, and as he turned, he saw her. For a long moment, nobody moved. His eyes, a startling pale gray in his tanned face, widened slightly, taking in the sight of the wild-eyed woman holding a peacemaker on him. He didn't shout, didn't startle. A slow, weary sort of understanding dawned on his face, followed by a flicker of something that might have been humor. He made no move to cover himself. He simply stood there, water beating on his skin, and looked her right in the eye. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly drawl that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "Right place, darling." The words broke the spell. Ada's shock curdled into a hot, defensive anger. Her knuckles were white on the grip of the Colt. "Don't move," she said, her own voice tight and thin. "Don't you dare move." He raised his hands slowly, palms out, in a universal gesture of peace that was made absurd by his complete lack of clothing. Wouldn't dream of it. A man's at a disadvantage in a situation like this. A corner of his mouth twitched, though I reckon you are too. "Shut up," she snapped. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "Name's Elias Hart," he said, his voice calm, "and I'm taking a bath, in my own cabin. A more pressing question might be what you're doing here, pointing that cannon at me." "This place looked empty," she insisted, her gaze darting around, refusing to settle on him. It was a hopeless endeavor. He filled the entire space. "Looks can be deceiving," he drawled. "Now, I'm fixing to put some pants on. You mind lowering that thing so I don't have to worry about you shooting off something important by accident?" Her cheeks burned. She was a woman grown, a widow, but she had never felt so flustered in her life. It was the sheer unexpectedness of it, the raw intimacy of the scene clashing with the mortal danger. "Stay right there. Turn around." He sighed, a sound of profound patience, and did as she said. Presenting her with his scarred back once more, he picked up a pair of denim trousers from the crate and began to pull them on, his movements unhurried. "You alone?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled as he worked the buttons. "What's it to you?" "Just curious. Not often I get visitors, especially not the armed and female kind. Makes a man wonder if he's got a price on his head he doesn't know about." He turned back to face her, now decently covered from the waist down. He was still barefoot, his chest bare, but it was an improvement. He folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. The hint of humor was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cool, assessing glint. "So, who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I told you, I was looking for shelter." Her story sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. "Shelter?" he repeated slowly, nodding as if considering it. "Folks looking for shelter don't usually bust in with a gun drawn. They knock. Or they call out, 'You move like a coyote sneaking into a hen house. So I'll ask again, who are you running from?'" They were at an impasse, a standoff between a half-dressed man and a desperate woman in a crumbling cabin in the middle of nowhere. He didn't believe her, and she didn't trust him an inch. He could be a squatter, an outlaw lying low. This cabin could belong to a family he'd murdered. The West was full of stories like that. "That's my business," she finally said. "Becomes my business when you bring it through my door with that thing in your hand," he countered, nodding toward the Colt. "Now, you can put the gun down, and we can talk civilized over what little coffee I got. Or you can keep standing there looking like a cornered cat, and we can see who gets tired first." Before she could answer, a strange sound reached them, a low, mournful moan that wasn't the wind she'd grown used to. The light in the main room shifted, dimming from a harsh white to a sickly, yellowish brown. Elias's gaze flicked past her to the window, "Hell," he muttered. He pushed past her, not touching her but forcing her to step back. He moved to the door and peered out. Ada followed, her gun still up but her attention now divided. The sky to the west was no longer blue. It was a churning, boiling wall of brown, a monstrous thing that was swallowing the horizon and rushing toward them with an audible roar. A dust storm. A bad one. "You're not going anywhere in that," he said, stating the obvious. He pulled the door shut just as the first gust of wind hit the cabin like a physical blow. The old logs groaned. A fine silt of red dust immediately began to snake in under the door and through the cracks in the walls. The roar outside intensified, becoming a deafening, abrasive scream. The world beyond the cabin walls had ceased to exist, erased by a tempest of earth and air. Elias turned from the door, his expression grim. He looked at Ada, at the gun she still held, though her arm had lowered slightly. The small, dusty room suddenly felt 100 times smaller, the air thick with tension, dust, and the unavoidable presence of each other. The storm had trapped them, forcing a truce that neither of them wanted. They were two strangers, armed and suspicious, locked in a box while the world tried to tear itself apart outside. He took a step toward the hearth, and she tensed, raising the barrel again. He stopped, raising his hands in that same gesture of weary surrender. "Look," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the howl of the wind. "You can hold that on me all night if you want, but that fire's going out, and it's going to get cold. Your argument ain't with me right now. It's with that." He jerked his chin toward the rattling door. "We can kill each other later. Tonight, we just need to stay alive." Ada looked from his steady, gray eyes to the door, which was shuddering in its frame. He was right. The immediate danger wasn't him. It was the storm. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the Colt peacemaker, though she did not put it away. She kept it resting on her lap as she backed toward one of the rickety chairs, her gaze never leaving him. The conflict was not over. It had merely been postponed. Outside, the wind howled its fury, and inside, the silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. The storm was a living thing. It screamed and clawed at the little cabin, throwing handfuls of sand against the walls that sounded like 1,000 tiny fists. Dust seeped through every crack, turning the air hazy and coating the back of Ada's throat. Elias moved with a quiet purpose that stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside. He stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps around the door and window, his movements economical and sure. He coaxed the fire back to life, adding split logs from a box near the hearth until the flames cast a warm, dancing light that pushed back the gloom. Ada remained in her chair, the Colt heavy in her lap, a silent sentinel watching his every move. He paid her no mind, or at least pretended not to. He fetched a dented coffee pot, filled it with water from a bucket, and scooped in grounds from a tin. Soon the cabin filled with the rich, bitter scent of brewing coffee, a smell of civilization and sanity that was almost painful in its normalcy. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin cups, set one on the table near her, and took the other for himself, leaning against the stone mantel of the hearth. "It'll blow itself out by morning," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the wind's shriek. He took a sip of his coffee. "Maybe sooner." She said nothing, just wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup. The heat was a comfort, a small island of solace. He was letting her be, and for that she was grudgingly grateful. The initial shock and anger were giving way to a bone-deep weariness she could no longer fight. Her whole body ached, but it was the raw, throbbing pain in her left shoulder that made her wince as she lifted the cup. His sharp gray eyes didn't miss the movement. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words a shield she'd used 1,000 times. He ignored her. He put his cup down on the mantel and walked to a small wooden chest in the corner. He opened it and rummaged inside, his broad back to her. Ada tensed, her hand tightening on her pistol, but he returned not with a weapon. but with a clean-looking strip of linen, a bottle of whiskey, and a small jar of dark salve. He placed them on the table beside her coffee. "Let me see it," he said. His tone was not gentle, but it wasn't unkind either. It was the voice of a man used to dealing with practical problems, whether it was a broken axle or a wounded animal. "No." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That arm's no good to you if it gets poisoned. From the way you're holding it, I'd say you took a fall, scraped it up good. Needs cleaning." He paused. "I'm not asking for your life story. Just trying to keep you from losing a limb in my house." She hesitated, caught between her ingrained distrust and the undeniable logic of his words. The shoulder was on fire. The torn fabric of her dress stuck to the wound. She'd cleaned it as best she could with creek water, but she knew it wasn't enough. She gave a short, sharp nod of assent. He pulled the other chair closer, the legs scraping on the wood floor. "All right then, let's see the damage." Her fingers fumbled with the buttons at her collar. She turned her body away from him, pulling the dress down just enough to expose the injury. It was an ugly, weeping scrape, raw and inflamed, running from her shoulder blade down her upper arm, courtesy of a slide down a shale embankment 2 days ago. Elias made a low sound in his throat. He uncorked the whiskey. This is gonna bite. He didn't coddle her. He simply soaked a corner of the linen and, with a surprisingly steady hand, began to clean the wound. The sting was so sharp it stole her breath. A tear squeezed from the corner of her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to make a sound, her free hand gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles were bone white. He worked quickly, his touch firm but not rough, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. When he was done, he opened the jar of salve. It smelled of pine and something else, something medicinal and clean. He applied it gently with his fingertips. The cool ointment soothed the fire in her skin almost instantly. Finally, he bound the wound with the rest of the linen strip, tying a neat, practical knot. "There," he said, sitting back. "Keep it clean. It'll heal." She pulled her dress back into place, her shoulder throbbing with a clean pain now instead of a festering one. The simple act of care, so unexpected, had breached her defenses more effectively than any threat could have. She felt a strange, unwelcome prickling behind her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the hard, weathered exterior to the man beneath. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the weary set of his mouth. This was a man who knew loss. He knew it in his bones. "Because out here," he said softly, "you die from little things. A rusty nail, a snake bite, a scrape that goes bad. No sense in letting the wilderness win if you don't have to." He picked up his coffee cup again. "Besides, I've seen men running from the law. They got a different look in their eyes. You're not running from a sheriff. You're running from a ghost." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The whole story, the one she'd held tight in her chest for weeks, spilled out of her in a torrent of quiet, desperate words. She told him about Thomas, about being left alone, about taking the job at the Blackwood Ranch. She told him about the rancher, a man whose smiles never reached his eyes, whose offers of help always came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. She didn't go into the foul details, but Elias's face tightened as she spoke, and she knew he understood. She told him about that last night in the barn, the smell of hay and whiskey, the struggle, the glint of the pistol, and the terrible, final sound that had set her on this path. "They'd have hung me," she finished, her voice flat and empty. "No one would have listened, a penniless widow against a man like that. It was my word against his memory. So I ran." She waited for the judgment, for the flicker of disgust or disbelief in his eyes. It never came. He just watched her, his expression somber, nodding slowly. He was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't believed her after all. Then he spoke, and his words were not of pity. but of a hard-won, bitter wisdom that resonated with her own fledgling cynicism. "Out here, truth don't matter much," he said, his voice a low drawl. "What you do next does." The simple finality of it settled over her, a strange and unexpected comfort. He wasn't judging her past. He was acknowledging her present. He saw her not as a criminal, but as a survivor, defined not by the gunshot in the barn, but by the next step she took in the dust. In the ensuing quiet, broken only by the abating howl of the wind, her eyes wandered around the sparse cabin. She noticed details she'd missed in her fear. The tools hanging neatly by the hearth were not a cowboy's. There was a heavy hammer, tongs, a set of files. They were blacksmith's tools. His hands, she realized, were not just strong. They were shaped by fire and steel. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece, next to his coffee cup, sat a small, dark object. It was a crudely forged iron horse, no bigger than her thumb. Its form simple, but its spirit captured perfectly. "You made that?" she asked, nodding toward it. His gaze followed hers, and a shudder came down over his face. So swift and absolute it was as if he'd turned to stone. The weariness in his eyes deepened into a raw, bottomless grief. "Yeah," he said, his voice clipped. "I was a smith, once." He looked away, back into the fire, "Made it for my boy." The finality in his tone forbade any more questions. The loss was a chasm in him, and she had stumbled right to the edge of it. They were two solitudes, sharing a fire, each nursing a wound the other could see but not touch. She, running from a life that was taken from her, and he, anchored to this place by a life that was gone. As dawn approached, the storm finally exhausted itself. The wind died down to a whisper, and a pale, watery light began to filter through the dusty window. The world outside was reborn, scoured clean and silent. The imperative of the storm was gone, and the tension returned. She was a fugitive. He was a stranger. There was no reason for her to stay. She stood up, her joints stiff. Her shoulder ached, but it was a manageable pain now. "I should go," she said, her voice husky. "Thank you for the coffee and this." She touched her bandaged arm. Elias pushed himself away from the mantel. He looked around the cabin, at the small drifts of dust in the corners, at the way the new light revealed the gaps in the mud chinking between the logs. "The roof leaks," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. "That storm proved it. And half this chinking is gone. Needs to be redone before the first real rains come." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "You're in no shape to travel far, and you got nowhere to go." He wasn't wrong. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a plea or a command. Just a simple, practical offer. "Help me with the cabin. A few days' work. I'll see you're fed, and you'll have a roof over your head. A place to heal up proper. After that, you can do what you want." She looked at him, at this quiet, broken man who had shown her more decency in one night than she'd seen in months. He was offering her a chance to stop running, if only for a little while. A chance to be a person again. Not just prey. A chance to figure out what to do next. "All right," she said, her voice small but clear in the quiet cabin. "I'll stay." The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by a calendar but by the sun's steady transit across the vast, indifferent sky. A week bled into 2, then 3, and the flimsy shelter Ada had stumbled into began to transform under their combined efforts. They worked from sunup to sundown, a team forged by necessity. They mixed mud, water, and straw with their bare hands, packing the thick daub into the gaps between the logs until the walls were solid and windproof. Elias, surprisingly nimble for a man his size, spent days on the sagging roof, prying up rotten shingles while she worked below, sorting the good wood from the bad. Their conversations were sparse, made up of practicalities. "Hand me that hammer. More water for the mix. Watch for rattlers in that wood pile." Yet, in the shared labor, a different kind of language grew between them. Ada learned the sharp, clean scent of his sweat, the low hum in his chest when he was concentrating, the way he could gentle his horse with a single, soft word. He, in turn, learned the determined set of her jaw when a task was difficult, the quick, efficient way she moved around the hearth, the rare, unguarded moments when a genuine smile would touch her lips as she watched a hawk circling on an updraft. She was a quick study. He showed her how to read the land, to find the north-facing slopes where moisture lingered, to recognize the tracks of deer and coyote. She learned to bake a passable cornbread in the Dutch oven, to mend his torn shirts with small, neat stitches, and to load the old Winchester rifle he kept mounted over the hearth, its weight a solid, reassuring thing in her hands. The Colt Peacemaker remained her own, a cold secret tucked away in her trunk, but she found herself relying on it less for comfort. This quiet life was a balm on her frayed nerves. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the simple exhaustion of a day's hard work. For the first time since Thomas's death, she slept soundly. The cabin's sturdy new walls, a fortress against the ghosts that had haunted her. She was discovering a strength in herself she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience born not of running, but of standing still and facing the day. The attraction between them was as undeniable and unspoken as the heat shimmering off the midday ground. It was a low, steady current that flowed in the space they shared. It was in the accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a tool. A jolt of warmth that lingered long after the contact was broken. It was in the way her gaze would sometimes catch on the corded muscles of his arms as he swung an axe, or how his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, her presence softening its hard, masculine edges. They both felt it, and they both fiercely ignored it. There was no room for such things in their fragile, temporary world. She was a woman with a price on her head, and he was a man anchored to a grief so profound he never spoke its name. To acknowledge the spark between them would be to invite a complication neither could afford, a vulnerability neither was ready to bear. So they kept to their careful distance, the silence between them thick with things unsaid. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. It was a welcome relief from the weeks of dry heat, a cleansing deluge that turned the red dust to dark, rich mud. They had spent the morning washing their spare clothes and blankets in the creek, and had left them hanging on a line strung between two cottonwoods to dry in the sun. "The laundry!" Ada cried, jumping up from the table where she was shelling beans. She ran out into the downpour, laughing as the cold rain plastered her thin dress to her skin. Elias followed a moment later, a faint smile on his own lips. They worked quickly, pulling the damp, heavy blankets and clothes from the line, the wind whipping at them, the thunder cracking directly overhead. They stumbled back into the cabin soaked to the bone, gasping and laughing, their arms full. Ada dumped her load on the floor and turned to take his. He was standing just inside the doorway, pulling his drenched shirt off over his head. Rainwater slicked his skin, glistening on his broad shoulders and the hard planes of his chest in the flickering firelight. Droplets clung to his dark hair and traced paths through the dusting of hair on his torso. It was a sight of startling, unadorned masculinity, and it made the air in her lungs catch. He saw her staring. That familiar wry humor flickered in his gray eyes. He tossed the wet shirt into the pile on the floor and met her gaze without a trace of self-consciousness. "Ain't nothing you haven't seen before." "Right," he drawled, his voice a low, intimate rumble under the drumming of the rain on the roof. The words hung in the air, a direct and teasing reference to the day they'd met. Her cheeks flushed hot, but this time there was no fear, no anger, just a sudden, dizzying awareness that constricted her chest. She couldn't think of a single clever thing to say. She just gave a little huff, turned her back to him, and began methodically wringing out a wet blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel his gaze on her back, a warm, physical pressure. The moment passed, but the air in the cabin had changed. The unspoken had been touched upon. and the space between them now shimmered with a new and dangerous energy. That feeling of safety she'd begun to cultivate was now complicated by something else, something thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. This man, Elias, was more than just a protector. He was becoming a presence in her life she was starting to depend on, a quiet center around which her chaotic world was beginning to find a new orbit. For Elias, her presence had been a slow-acting medicine. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield against memory had been filled with the soft sounds of her movements, the scent of baking bread, the low murmur of her voice when she sometimes spoke to his horse. He found himself fixing things he'd long ignored, not just for practicality, but for her. He planed the rough wood of the table until it was smooth, built a small shelf for her few belongings, and even repaired the broken rocking chair that had sat in the corner, unused for over a year. He was waking up from a long, gray dream. He was building a home again, and the realization was both a comfort and a sharp, twisting pain. The world intruded 2 days later. He came at midday, a speck on the horizon that slowly grew into a man on a tired-looking gray horse. He was thin and wiry, with a weasel's face and eyes that shifted constantly, taking in everything. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, and a tarnished badge was pinned to his dusty vest. Elias saw him first. "Inside," he said to Ada, his voice low and urgent. "Now, in the lean-to, don't make a sound." The blood drained from her face. She didn't question him. She scrambled into the small room where they'd first met and pulled the canvas sheet closed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found a crack in the logs and put her eye to it, her whole body trembling. Elias stood in front of the cabin, relaxed and unassuming, wiping his hands on a rag as the rider approached. "Afternoon," the stranger said, pulling his horse to a stop. He didn't dismount. His shifty eyes scanned the cabin, the repaired roof, the neat woodpile. "This your place?" "It is," Elias said, his voice level. "Name's Riggs, bounty man." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "I'm looking for a woman. Goes by Whitmore. Ada Whitmore. You might have heard of her. Wanted for murder out of Prescott." Ada pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Hearing her name spoken aloud was like a physical blow. Elias's expression didn't flicker. He shook his head slowly. "Can't say that ain't seen a soul out here in months. Just me and the dust." Riggs squinted, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "That's so this trail leads past here. If she came this way, she'd have needed water. Might have stopped." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice becoming conspiratorial. $500 for her. A man could do a lot with that kind of money. Maybe you saw a woman, didn't know who she was. Dark hair, maybe green eyes, on the tall side for a woman. Ada held her breath, her world narrowing to the tiny crack in the wall. This was it. A man could do a lot with $500, enough to leave this hard place, start over somewhere new. Elias was a stranger, bound to her by nothing more than a few weeks of shared work. Elias met the bounty hunter's greedy gaze with a look of utter calm. He tossed the rag onto a nearby stump. "Like I said," he repeated, his voice flat and final, "I ain't seen no one. You're welcome to water your horse at the creek, but then I'd ask you to be on your way. I'm not a sociable man." There was a quiet authority in his tone, a hint of steel beneath the surface that Riggs clearly recognized. The bounty hunter stared at him for a long, hard moment, then shrugged, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "Your loss," he grunted. He turned his horse, kicked its sides, and rode off without a backward glance, disappearing back the way he had come. Ada stayed frozen in the lean-to until the sound of the horse's hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast silence of the desert. She heard Elias move, his heavy footsteps crossing the main room. The canvas sheet was pulled aside. He stood there, blocking the light, his face a grim, unreadable mask. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with 1,000 unasked questions. He had lied for her. He had stood between her and the gallows, turning away a small fortune without a moment's hesitation. He had risked everything for her. He didn't offer any explanation. He just looked at her, and in the depths of his steady gray eyes, she saw a silent, unbreakable promise. The fragile truce between them had been shattered, replaced by something far more profound and terrifying. He had chosen a side. He had chosen her. And, in the quiet of the dusty cabin, Ada Whitmore knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that she was no longer alone. The false peace held for 2 days. A fragile skin stretched over a deep well of anxiety. Every shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Every snap of a twig in the distance made Ada's heart leap into her throat. They worked, but the easy rhythm was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Elias's Winchester was never far from his hand, and Ada found herself unconsciously touching the hidden bulk of the Colt in her skirt, a habit she thought she had broken. They came at dusk. The setting sun had painted the horizon in brutal strokes of orange and blood red, and the air was cooling rapidly. Ada was inside, tending a pot of stew over the fire, when Elias's voice, sharp and low, cut through the evening calm from just outside the door. "Ada, get the rifle." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy Winchester from its pegs over the hearth, her hands steady despite the frantic drumming in her chest. She checked the load and moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass. 3 riders were emerging from the cottonwoods by the creek, walking their horses slowly, deliberately. The man in the middle was the bounty hunter, Riggs. The 2 flanking him were strangers, hard-faced men with the dead-eyed look of hired guns. This wasn't a casual inquiry. This was an invasion. Elias backed into the cabin, pulling the heavy door shut and dropping the thick wooden bar into place. He turned to her, his face grim in the firelight. "Stay away from the window. They'll try to draw a shot." "They know I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. He knew, Elias corrected. Riggs suspected. Now he's back to make sure. A voice hailed them from outside, laced with a smug confidence. "Hart, we know you're in there, and we know the woman is with you. Send her out, and my employer might let you live." Elias ignored him. He moved to the side of the door, his own revolver in his hand. "They want you, not me. When I open that door, you run. Out the back, through the lean-to. Don't stop for anything. Head for the rocks. I'll hold them here as long as I can." "No," she said, horrified. "They'll kill you." "They'll kill me anyway," he said, his voice flat. "They can't leave a witness. This is your only chance. Go." He didn't wait for her to argue. He took a deep breath, and with a sudden, violent motion, he lifted the bar and threw the door open, firing a single shot over the riders' heads to startle their horses. "Now, Ada, run." She turned to obey, a sob catching in her throat. But it was already too late. One of the hired guns had dismounted and crept around the side of the cabin. As she darted for the lean-to, he burst through the rear canvas, a hulking shape against the dying light. He grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, his arm a band of iron around her ribs. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but he was immensely strong. The sound of her struggle made Elias turn for a fatal second. In that instant of distraction, Riggs fired. The bullet slammed into Elias's left shoulder, the same side Ada had injured. He staggered back with a grunt of pain, his revolver clattering to the floor. The second gunman was on him in a flash, pressing the barrel of a shotgun to his throat. It was over in less than 10 seconds. They dragged them both outside into the dusty clearing. The man holding Ada threw her to the ground at Riggs's feet. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs. Elias was forced to his knees, blood already soaking the shoulder of his shirt, his face pale but set in a mask of defiant fury. Riggs dismounted, a cruel smile twisting his thin lips. He looked down at Ada, then at Elias. "Should have taken the money when you had the chance. Hart, would have been a lot cleaner. A fourth rider emerged from the trees, moving at a stately pace. He was older than the others, dressed in a fine black coat that seemed out of place in the wilderness. He sat tall in a silver-trimmed saddle, his face a cold, patrician mask of authority. As he drew closer, Ada felt a jolt of sick recognition. She had seen him once before, visiting the ranch. It was Silas Blackwood, the man she'd shot. He had been this man's son. Blackwood halted his horse and looked down at them, his eyes as cold and dead as river stones. He ignored Ada completely, his gaze fixed on Elias. "Well, Hart," he said, his voice a low, cultured sneer. "It seems your taste for strays has finally gotten the better of you. I recall warning you about that very flaw when you worked my forge." The pieces crashed together in Ada's mind. Elias had worked for him. He knew this monster. "She's innocent." "Blackwood," Elias gritted out, blood dripping from his chin where one of the men had struck him. "Your son was a brute, and you know it." Blackwood's face tightened. "My son is dead, at the hands of this woman. That is the only truth that matters now. My family's name will not be sullied by her lies." He finally turned his cold gaze on Ada. "The $500 was for bringing you back alive, so you could hang legally. But you've proven to be too much trouble. My instructions to Mr. Riggs have changed. He is now being paid to see that you simply disappear. No trial, no witnesses, no story." The cold finality of his words was worse than any threat. He wasn't just seeking justice. He was erasing a problem. He was burying his son's sins with her body. "What about him?" Riggs asked, jerking his thumb at Elias. "He made his choice when he harbored a killer," Blackwood said without emotion. "Tie him to the support post. We'll deal with him after the primary business is concluded." The hired guns hauled Elias to one of the thick wooden posts holding up the porch roof, binding his hands tightly behind it. They dragged Ada away, toward the creek bank, out of Elias's line of sight. One man held her arms pinned behind her back while Riggs drew his pistol, checking the cylinder with slow, deliberate movements. This was it, the end of the trail. But as the man holding her adjusted his grip, his focus on Riggs, Ada felt his hand slide past the small, hard lump in the pocket of her skirt. They hadn't searched her. They had seen a terrified woman, and in their arrogance, they had overlooked the possibility that she might still be dangerous. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror. She could try to run. In the deepening twilight, she might make it to the trees. She could disappear, leave this all behind, leave Elias to his fate. It was the sensible thing to do. The survivor's choice. Then she saw Elias, straining against his bonds, his eyes blazing with a helpless rage as he watched them lead her away. And his words echoed in her head, as clear as if he were whispering in her ear. "What you do next does." Running had been her only choice before. It wasn't anymore. He had stood for her. He had lied for her, bled for her. To run now would be to betray the only true decency she had known in months. It would be to let the wilderness win after all. Her decision was made in the space of a heartbeat. Riggs raised his pistol, aiming it at her head. "Nothing personal, ma'am," he said, the cruel smile back on his face. With a surge of adrenaline, Ada stomped down hard on the instep of the man holding her. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away, her hand diving into her pocket, closing around the familiar walnut grip of the Colt. She drew the gun in one fluid motion, a muscle memory from 1,000 terrified nights, and fired. The heavy pistol bucked in her hand. The man who had been holding her staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed without a sound. Riggs swore, swinging his pistol toward her, but he was too slow. She fired again. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make him dive for cover behind a cottonwood. "Kill the woman," Blackwood roared from his horse. The third gunman, who had been watching Elias, turned and raised his rifle. From the porch, Elias let out a desperate yell and threw his entire body weight against the post, trying to rip it from the ground. The old wood groaned. Ada didn't wait. She ran, not away, but in a zigzag pattern toward the cabin, firing her third shot at the rifleman to keep his head down. The bullet chewed splinters from the log wall near his head. Dust kicked up at her feet as he returned fire. She reached the corner of the cabin and scrambled behind it, her lungs burning, her heart about to explode. She had 3 shots left. She risked a glance around the corner. The rifleman was reloading. Riggs was still pinned behind his tree, and Elias, with a final, desperate heave, had managed to splinter the rotted porch post. He wasn't free, but he was no longer tethered. He slammed his bound hands against the remains of the post, trying to break his bonds. Blackwood spurred his horse forward, drawing a fancy-looking revolver from his coat. Useless fools, I'll do it myself. Ada knew she couldn't face them all. She had to free Elias. She broke cover, sprinting for the front of the cabin. The rifleman fired. The shot so close she felt the heat of it pass her ear. She didn't stop. She reached Elias and pressed her Colt into his bound hands. "I can't see the rope," she gasped. "You'll have to do it." He understood immediately. Keeping his body between her and the gunman, he twisted his hands, aiming the pistol backward at the thick rope binding his wrists. He fired. The roar was deafeningly close. The rope exploded, and his hands were free. He grabbed the Colt from her, his eyes blazing. "Get inside," he commanded, shoving her toward the door. He spun around the corner, firing twice. The rifleman cried out and fell. Riggs, seeing his odds had changed, fired one last wild shot before melting back into the darkness of the trees. Now only Silas Blackwood remained, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He raised his revolver, aiming at Ada as she scrambled through the doorway. "No," Elias roared. He launched himself off the porch, ignoring the searing pain in his wounded shoulder. He met Blackwood's charge like 2 stags locking horns. He grabbed the barrel of Blackwood's gun, forcing it upward just as it fired, sending a harmless shot into the twilight sky. With his good arm, he slammed his fist into Blackwood's jaw, knocking the older man from his saddle. They both fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Blackwood was wiry and strong, fueled by hatred. He fought like a cornered snake, kicking and clawing. But Elias was driven by something more primal. He was defending his home. He was defending her. He struggled to his feet, the Colt still in his hand. Blackwood rose, pulling a long knife from his boot. He lunged. Elias fired. The single shot was flat and final in the sudden quiet. Blackwood stopped, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark circle on his pristine black coat, then up at Elias. He crumpled to the dust without another word. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the ragged sound of Elias's breathing. The battle was over. The horizon was dark. Elias stood over the body of the man he had once worked for, the man who had tried to destroy them both. There was no victory in his eyes, only a profound and terrible exhaustion. He took 2 steps toward the cabin, toward her, then his legs gave out. He fell to his knees, and then collapsed sideways into the red dust, unconscious before he hit the ground. For a long moment, Ada was paralyzed by the silence. The echoes of the gunshots faded, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the gentle rustle of the wind in the cottonwoods. The clearing was a tableau of sudden, violent death, bathed in the deep purple of twilight. Then, a primal fear, colder and sharper than any she had known while running, seized her. It was the fear of being left truly alone. She scrambled from the doorway and ran to him, falling to her knees in the dust beside his still form. His face was ashen in the gloom, his breathing shallow and uneven. The front of his shoulder was a dark, wet ruin of cloth and blood. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Elias, no." He didn't stir. Panic gave way to a desperate, focused energy. She couldn't leave him out here. She couldn't. He was a tall, heavy man, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Getting him inside seemed an impossible task, but the alternative was unthinkable. She looped her arms under his, planting her feet, and pulled. He moved an inch, his boot dragging a furrow in the dirt, gritting her teeth, her own newly healed shoulders screaming in protest. She pulled again, and then again, dragging him backward one grueling inch at a time across the clearing, away from the dead men and toward the sanctuary of the cabin. It felt like an eternity. By the time she got him over the threshold, her body was trembling with exhaustion, her lungs on fire. She managed to roll him onto the narrow cot he had given her, his head lolling to one side, the small space immediately filled with the coppery smell of his blood. Working by the flickering light of the hearth, she tore open his shirt. The bullet had gone in high, a ragged, ugly hole that was still weeping blood. She knew enough to know it had to be cleaned, and the ball of lead removed if it was still in there. The next few hours became a waking nightmare. She built the fire up until it roared, heating water in the kettle until it steamed. She found his whiskey bottle and sterilized the tip of his skinning knife in the flames, the metal glowing a dull red. Her hands shook, but her purpose was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She probed the wound, her stomach churning at the feel of it, until the knife tip scraped against something solid. Holding her breath, she managed to work the flattened piece of lead out. She cleaned the wound relentlessly with boiled water and whiskey, ignoring his low, unconscious moans. She packed it with the last of the pine salve and bound it tightly with strips of linen torn from her own petticoat. His skin was hot to the touch. The fever had already taken hold. All through the night, she sat by his side, bathing his face with a cool, damp cloth, listening to the sound of his labored breathing, a fragile rhythm in the profound silence. Sometime before dawn, she forced herself to go back outside. The world was still and cold under a blanket of stars. The bodies of the 3 men lay where they had fallen, grotesque shapes in the moonlight. She couldn't leave them. Taking Elias's shovel, she dragged each man away from the cabin, down toward the creek, her movements a grim, mechanical parody of her earlier struggle with Elias. She didn't have the strength to dig 3 graves. Instead, she covered them with a cairn of heavy river stones, a rough, anonymous monument to a morning of violence. The task took hours, and by the time the sun's first rays touched the horizon, she was caked in dirt and numb to the core. She spent the next 2 days in a blur of sleepless vigilance. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, changed his dressings, and listened to him murmur in a fever dream, words she couldn't understand about a fire and a name. Jacob, spoken with a voice of pure anguish. In those long, quiet hours, the cabin transformed around her. It was no longer a temporary shelter, a hiding place. It was a fortress she was defending. Every log, every stone in the hearth was part of a home she was refusing to lose. She realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that home had never been a place with 4 walls. Her first home had been Thomas, and when he died, she had become a ghost. Now, home was the unconscious, broken man on the cot, the man who had stood for her, who had bled for her. The thought of him not waking up was a physical pain, a hollowness that threatened to consume her. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. His skin was cool and damp, his breathing deeper, more even. She had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on the edge of the cot, and she woke to the feeling of a hand weakly touching her hair. Her head snapped up. His eyes were open. They were cloudy with pain and exhaustion, but they were his eyes, that same pale, steady gray. He was looking at her. The relief that washed over her was so immense, so overwhelming, that it broke through the dam of her control. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her dusty cheek, followed by another, and then another. She couldn't stop them. She wasn't sobbing, just weeping in a silent, hopeless cascade of fear and gratitude and exhaustion. He watched her, his expression softening. A faint, crooked smile touched his lips, and his voice, when it came, was a dry, scratchy whisper, a ghost of his usual drawl. "Guess you found the right place after all, darling." The words, the same ones he had spoken that first day, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Then, they had been the wry remark of a stranger, a joke laced with suspicion. Now, they were something else entirely. They were a confirmation, a benediction. They were an anchor in the storm-tossed wreckage of her life. She choked back a laugh that was half a sob and scrubbed at her face with the back of her hand. "You're an idiot, Elias Hart," she whispered, her voice thick. "Reckon so?" he rasped. "Did you—" His gaze flickered toward the door, his brow furrowing with the effort of memory. "It's done," she said quietly, sparing him the details. "They're gone. Blackwood. All of them." He closed his eyes for a long moment, a muscle working in his jaw. "He would have killed you." "He would have killed us both," she corrected softly. "You saved my life." "You came back for me," he said, his eyes opening again, locking on hers. "You had the gun. You could have run." "You once told me that what a person does next is what matters," she replied, her voice gaining a little of its strength. Running wasn't the right next thing to do. A deep understanding passed between them, a shared knowledge of the price that had been paid in the dusty clearing. He had taken a life to protect her, an act that would leave its own scar, and she had chosen to stand and fight beside him rather than save herself. They were bound together now, not by attraction or necessity, but by a shared crucible of violence and sacrifice. He lay quietly for a while, gathering his strength. She brought him water, helping him to drink. Later, she fed him a thin broth, her hands gentle as she supported his head. The domestic intimacy of the act was a stark contrast to the brutality that had come before. "We can't stay here," she said that evening, her voice low as she sat by the fire. It was a thought that had been nagging at her. "Someone will come looking for Blackwood. A man like that doesn't just disappear. They'll find this place. They'll find us." He was silent for a long time, watching the flames dance. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were clear and resolved. "No," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm not running anymore. I came out here to disappear, to let this place swallow me up. But you—" He paused, turning his head on the pillow to look at her. "You came along and reminded me that a man can't just bury himself. He's got to stand on his own ground." He shifted, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. "Blackwood. He took my boy, not with his own hands, but he sent us out there, chasing rustlers that weren't there, right into an Apache raid. All for a piece of land he wanted. I ran from that. From him. I can't run from him now that he's in the ground." He took a slow, deliberate breath. "This place, this cabin, it was just a shell. A place to wait for the end. Now." He looked around the small room, at the neatly patched walls, the clean swept floor, at her sitting in the firelight. "Now it's something else," he finished softly. "This land's rough, but it's ours now." "Ours," the words settled into the quiet spaces of her heart, filling a void she didn't even know was there. He wasn't leaving. He was choosing to stay. Here, with her. He was claiming this blood-soaked piece of earth as their own. The cabin was no longer a symbol of his grief or her flight. It was their beginning. It was the place where two lost souls, battered by the world, had found their ground, their purpose, their unlikely home. The days that followed were a quiet testament to the slow, stubborn process of healing. Elias's recovery was measured in small victories the first time he sat up on his own, the first time he walked, leaning heavily on Ada's shoulder, to the cabin door to breathe the clean, dry air. His strength returned in fragments, and in his weakness, a new dynamic formed between them. Ada became the caretaker, the protector. She learned the geography of his wound, changing the dressing with a practiced gentleness that belied her inexperience. She hunted small game with the Winchester, her aim becoming surer with each shot, and brought back rabbits for the stew pot. Autumn arrived not with a grand announcement, but in a series of subtle shifts. The relentless heat of summer bled from the days, leaving behind a pleasant warmth that deepened into a distinct chill at night. The air grew crisp, carrying the sharp, resinous scent of pine from the higher elevations. The cottonwood leaves along the creek turned a brittle, translucent gold, rustling in a wind that now spoke with a deeper, more melancholic voice. It was a season of gathering, of preparing for the coming cold, and the work of rebuilding their small world consumed them. With his good arm, Elias taught her how to repair the sections of the corral fence that had fallen into disrepair. They worked side by side, Ada digging the post holes, her muscles growing lean and hard, while he used an adze to shape the new rails, the rhythmic thud of the tool a steady heartbeat in the quiet afternoons. They were not just building a fence, they were drawing a line in the dust, defining their small patch of existence against the vast, untamed wilderness. "This ground is good," he said one afternoon, crumbling a handful of dark, rich earth from the creek bed between his fingers. "We can grow things here. Beans, squash, corn, maybe closer to the water." The idea of planting seeds, of putting down roots in this place that had been marked by so much violence, was a radical act of hope. The next day, they tilled a small plot of land near the cabin, turning over the soil with a shovel in their bare hands. They found a small sack of pinto beans in his supplies, forgotten in a corner of the lean-to, and they planted them in neat, careful rows. As Ada pressed the hard, smooth beans into the cool earth, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known was possible. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. Their evenings were quiet, spent in the warm glow of the hearth. The charged silence that had once defined their interactions had softened into a comfortable quietude. They talked more, sharing small, inconsequential stories that slowly filled in the vast, empty spaces of their pasts. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith, and about his time in the army, a period he spoke of with a detached weariness that hinted at old horrors. One night, as a cold wind rattled the door, she found herself telling him about her childhood in a dusty Kansas town, an orphan raised by a stern, God-fearing aunt. "She never had a window on the east side of the house," Ada said, her voice soft, her gaze lost in the fire. "She said it was vanity to want to see the sunrise. She said the day's work should begin in the dark, with prayer, not with staring at the sky." She smiled, a sad, faint curve of her lips. "I used to sneak out to the barn, just to climb up into the hayloft and watch it. The way the light comes up, first gray, and then pink, and then gold, chasing all the shadows away. I always promised myself that one day I'd have a house of my own, a little house, with a window in the kitchen that faced the dawn, so I could watch the world be born new every single morning." She fell silent, a little embarrassed by the childish confession. It felt foolish to speak of such a simple dream in a world that had been so cruel. Elias was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful as he watched her. "When my shoulder's right," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble. "I'll build you that window." Her head snapped up, and she stared at him. It wasn't an idle promise. It was a vow. He was offering to cut a hole in the wall of his fortress, to let the light in, all for a forgotten dream she had shared in a moment of weakness. He was telling her, without saying the words, that this was her house too, that he wanted to watch the sunrise with her. The first rain of the season came a week later. It was a cold, steady drizzle that began at midnight and continued through the next day, turning the world outside into a wash of gray and brown. It smelled of wet dust and new life, and the sound of it on the roof was a soothing, constant drumming. They stayed inside, the fire crackling, the cabin filled with a sense of cozy, impenetrable safety. The new chinking held, and the repaired roof did not leak. They had built their shelter well. The unspoken tension, The physical awareness that had simmered between them for weeks was a tangible presence in the close confines of the cabin. The careful distance they had maintained seemed to shrink with every passing hour. By evening, the air was thick with it. Every accidental touch was a spark. Every shared glance held a new and profound weight. After their simple meal of cornbread and jerky, Ada went to the bucket to wash the tin plates. Elias came up behind her, taking the plate from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The contact was electric, a current that shot up her arm and settled deep in her chest. She turned slowly to face him. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the flicker of the firelight reflected in the depths of his gray eyes. The sounds of the rain and the fire faded into a distant murmur. There was nothing in the world but the two of them, standing in the heart of the home they had built together. He raised his good hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. He cupped her jaw, his calloused thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was not demanding, but a question, a gentle, reverent inquiry. She leaned into his hand, a small, involuntary movement of surrender and acceptance, and closed her eyes. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate, pent-up passion. It was a kiss of profound and aching tenderness, a soft meeting of lips that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of a quiet, wondering joy. It was the taste of wood smoke and coffee, of shared sorrow and newfound hope. She brought her hands up to his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her face. "Ada," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. He led her to the cot, his cot, which she had been tending him in for weeks. He sat her down on the edge and knelt before her, his hands gently unlacing her worn, dusty boots. He chafed her cold feet between his warm hands, the simple, humble gesture a testament to a devotion that needed no words. There was no haste, no fumbling urgency. Their coming together was a slow, graceful unfolding, as natural and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Every touch was exploratory and gentle, a rediscovery of comfort and trust in another person's arms. For Ada, it was a healing, a reclaiming of herself from the harsh memories of the past. For Elias, it was a homecoming, a return from a long and lonely exile of the heart. In the warm, fire-lit cabin, with the sound of the life-giving rain falling on the roof, two broken people found a way to be whole again, their bodies and their spirits finally, irrevocably intertwined. She fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. The world they had rebuilt together was a fragile paradise, bounded by the creek on one side and the mesa on the other. The weeks that followed their first night together were steeped in a quiet, sun-drenched peace. Elias's shoulder healed into a puckered, angry scar, a permanent reminder of the price of their sanctuary. But his strength returned fully, true to his word. As soon as he could properly swing a hammer, he began to build her window. He cut a new opening in the east-facing wall of the cabin, framing it with smooth, planed cottonwood. He had no glass, but he fashioned a heavy shutter that could be barred at night and thrown open in the morning. The first day she opened it, the dawn spilled into the cabin, a wave of liquid gold that chased the last of the shadows from the corners and made the dust motes dance in the air. It was more beautiful than any dream she had ever dared to have. Their life fell into a simple, harmonious pattern. They were rarely more than a few feet from each other. Yet the space never felt crowded. It felt complete. She learned the rhythms of his moods, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was thinking hard, the low rumble of his laugh that seemed to start deep in his chest. He, in turn, learned the language of her silences, the quick, bright flash of her smile when she was truly happy, the way she hummed softly to herself when she kneaded dough for their bread. They were two halves of a whole, fitted together by hardship and healed by a quiet, steady love. The outside world, with its laws and judgments, seemed a million miles away. It was a half-forgotten nightmare, but the world has a long memory, and one bright, cloudless afternoon in late autumn, it found them. They came on 5 horses, a small posse led by a man with a silver star pinned to his dusty coat. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of the law, their faces grim and unreadable. Elias, who had been splitting wood, saw them first. He laid down his axe, his body going still, and called her name. The easy peace of the morning evaporated in an instant. Ada came to the doorway, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. The sight of the star made her blood run cold. The past she had thought buried had risen from its shallow grave. The marshal, a tall, graying man with tired eyes, reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin. "Elias Hart," he called out, his voice a reasonable, non-threatening baritone. "That's me," Elias said, stepping forward, placing himself slightly in front of Ada. The marshal's gaze flickered to Ada, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "We've been investigating the disappearance of Mr. Silas Blackwood and some of his associates. Their trail went cold about a month back, somewhere out in this direction." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We found a place down by the creek, a grave of sorts. Found 3 bodies under a pile of rocks. One of them was a known bounty man named Riggs. The other 2 were hired guns from out of the territory." Ada's hands clenched in the folds of her skirt. She could feel the noose tightening. The marshal continued, his eyes on Elias. "We also found Mr. Blackwood, buried proper, in a single grave. Now, I knew you used to work for Blackwood, and folks in town say he wasn't a man to be trifled with. So, before we start making assumptions, my deputy and I would like to hear your side of what happened out here." It was a fair offer, far fairer than she had expected. But fairness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She saw the path ahead with chilling clarity. A trial. Questions. Elias implicated in her crime, they would hang him for defending her. That night, after the marshal and his men had made a cold camp down by the creek, promising to return in the morning for their statement, Ada made her decision. Elias was asleep, his breathing deep and even beside her in the narrow cot. She slipped out from under the blanket, her movements silent. She packed a small bundle, a little jerky, a canteen of water, and the Colt Peacemaker. It was time to run again. She would go to the marshal, confess to everything, and insist she had acted alone, that Elias had found her after the fact. It was the only way to save him. As her hand touched the door latch, his voice came out of the darkness, low and certain. "Don't!" She froze, her back to him. "I'm not letting you do it." "Ada," he said. He was sitting up now, a silhouette against the faint glow of the banked fire. "I'm not letting you throw yourself on the fire to keep me warm." "They'll hang you?" she whispered, turning to face him, tears blurring her vision. "Because of me. All of this is because of me." "No," he said, his voice firm. He stood up and came to her, taking the bundle from her nerveless fingers. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze in the dim light. "All of this is because of a bad man who hurt you. The only thing we did wrong was survive him. We are not going to start lying now. Not to them and not to each other." "What choice do we have?" she cried softly. "My word means nothing." "Our word," he corrected her gently. "Together, we tell them the truth. Ada, all of it. From the very beginning. We stand on the ground we fought for, and we see what happens. I won't run from this, and I won't let you run for me." His conviction was a rock in the swirling tide of her fear. He was asking for an impossible leap of faith, but looking into his steady, resolute eyes, she found she was willing to take it. The hearing was held 2 days later in the nearby town of Socorro. It wasn't a formal trial, but an inquest held in a stuffy, sun-baked room that served as the town's courthouse, library, and land office. A circuit judge presided, a stern, hawk-nosed man named Potter. They were represented by a young, overworked lawyer named Mr. Davies, who had listened to their story with a mixture of skepticism and weary sympathy. Ada told her story first. She spoke in a low, clear voice, starting with the day she arrived at the Blackwood Ranch and ending with the gunshots in the dusty clearing by the cabin. She left nothing out, her words painting a stark, unvarnished picture of her desperation. The room was silent, the only sound the scratching of a clerk's pen. When she was finished, Elias spoke, his voice a low counterpoint to hers, corroborating every detail, his testimony a solid, unshakable foundation beneath her own. The judge listened impassively, his face giving nothing away. When they were done, the prosecuting attorney, a slick, well-fed man from Santa Fe, scoffed. "Your Honor, it's a compelling story, but it is just that, a story. The word of a fugitive and a recluse against a respected, powerful man like Silas Blackwood." Mr. Davies stood up. "It is more than a story. Your Honor, the death of Silas Blackwood has, shall we say, loosened some tongues back at his ranch." He held up a piece of paper. "This is a sworn affidavit from a woman named Sarah, a maid who worked for the Blackwood family for 5 years. In it, she details the younger Mr. Blackwood's aggressive and unwanted advances toward Mrs. Whitmore, and her own attempts to warn her. She also states that Silas Blackwood was fully aware of his son's proclivities and chose to ignore them." A murmur went through the small courtroom. "Furthermore," Davies continued, pressing his advantage, "we have a letter, one Sarah wrote to her sister a week before the incident, detailing her fears for Mrs. Whitmore's safety. It's postmarked. It proves this isn't some recently invented fabrication to save her own skin. It proves she was telling the truth then, just as she is telling the truth now." He laid the letter on the judge's desk. Judge Potter read it, his expression grim. He looked at Ada, a new light of understanding in his eyes. After a long, deliberative silence, he rendered his verdict. Ada was exonerated of the charges in Prescott. The death of the younger Blackwood ruled a clear act of self-defense. Elias was cleared in the deaths of Blackwood and his men, also on the grounds of self-defense. They were free. The relief was so profound it left her feeling weak and dizzy. As they left the courthouse, the townspeople stared, their whispers following them like buzzing flies. They were not fugitives anymore, but they were not welcome either. Mr. Davies walked with them to their horse. "You're free in the eyes of the law," the young lawyer said, his tone kind but firm. "But a story like this, it sticks to a person, especially a woman. Your reputation in this territory is ruined. If you want any kind of a peaceful life, my advice is to sell that plot of land and move on. Go to California, Oregon, somewhere no one knows your name." His practical words struck Ada with the force of a physical blow. He was right. She could be legally innocent, but she would forever be the woman who had killed her employer. The woman an outlaw had died defending. Any hope she had for a normal life, a quiet existence, was impossible here. The stares and whispers would follow them forever. They were silent as they rode out of town. The weight of their newfound freedom was heavier than she could have imagined. She looked at Elias, at his strong, stoic profile, and a wave of guilt washed over her. He had a chance to be left alone, to live in peace, but tied to her, he would always be an outcast. "He's right," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the plodding of the horse's hooves. "I should go. I'll sign the land over to you. You deserve a life here. Without me dragging you down?" Elias pulled the horse to a stop in the middle of the empty, sun-baked road. He turned in the saddle to face her, and his eyes were fierce. "Do you really think I care what a bunch of gossips in a dusty town think of me? Do you think after everything we've been through that I would let you go, just so I can have a peaceful life?" He shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "Ada, I was a dead man walking when you found me. This life, with you, is the only peace I've ever known." "But they'll never stop talking," she whispered, her heart aching. "You'll be an outcast because of me." He reached out and took her hand, his grip strong and sure. His gaze held hers, unwavering, a promise of absolute certainty. "Then I'll go where you go," he said, his voice low and steady, each word a stone laid in the foundation of their future. "The land's the same if you've got someone worth it." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a love so profound it hurt. He was not just choosing her, he was choosing their life, their story, no matter how scarred it was. He was telling her that she was his home, and it didn't matter where that home was pitched. She squeezed his hand, a silent answer that said everything. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Without another word, he turned the horse, not west toward California, not north toward Oregon, but back east, toward the small, sturdy cabin with a new window that faced the dawn. They were not running. They were going home. A year passes in the way that time moves in the high desert, measured not in the frantic ticking of clocks, but in the slow, grand cycles of the sun and seasons. The small, battered cabin, once a monument to grief and a desperate refuge, had put down roots and blossomed into a home. The clearing, once stained with blood and fear, was now a place of life. The land, which had once seemed so hostile, had yielded to their relentless, shared labor. The garden plot they had started with a handful of beans was now a thriving patch of green, boasting rows of sturdy corn, sprawling squash vines, and tenacious chili plants that added a welcome fire to their meals. Elias, with an engineer's eye and a blacksmith's strength, had dug a well, lining it with stone until it drew up water that was sweet and cold and tasted of the deep earth. The new well pump he'd constructed from scavenged parts no longer groaned, but offered a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound of life and sustenance. The corral was strong and secure, housing not only Elias's steady gelding, but also a gentle mare they had bought in town. Smoke rose from the stone chimney not just in the chill of morning and evening, but in the middle of the day. A constant, fragrant plume that spoke of baking bread, simmering stew, and a hearth that was never cold. They had made a life where none had been, their two intertwined histories plowing the hard ground and planting something new. They went to Socorro 4 times a year, for flour, salt, coffee, and news of the wider world. The whispers still followed them, the sidelong glances of the townspeople a constant reminder of their violent beginning. But the shame and fear that had once plagued Ada were gone, replaced by a quiet, unassailable dignity. She would look the whisperers in the eye, her gaze clear and steady, with Elias a solid, unmovable presence at her side. They were not outcasts anymore. They were simply themselves, and they had learned that their own judgment was the only one that truly mattered. It was on one of those trips, in the heat of late summer, that they found him. They were in the general store when the doctor came in, his face etched with a familiar weariness. A fever had swept through a small homestead south of town, leaving behind nothing but 2 fresh graves and a boy of about 6, a silent, hollow-eyed child with hair the color of corn silk and a soul that seemed to have retreated to a place no one could reach. His name was Leo. He had no other family. The town council was debating sending him to an orphanage in Santa Fe, a grim institution from which few children ever truly escaped. Ada looked at Elias, and in his eyes she saw the same thought that was blooming in her own heart. She saw the ghost of his own lost son, Jacob, and he saw the reflection of her own orphaned childhood. There were no words, no discussion. It was a decision made in a single, shared glance of absolute certainty. They took Leo home. The first few weeks were an exercise in profound and patient love. The boy did not speak. He moved through the cabin like a little ghost, his eyes wide, flinching at any sudden movement. He would not eat at the table with them, but would take a piece of bread and retreat to a corner, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Ada did not press him. She simply made sure there was always food for him, talked to him in a low, soothing voice as she went about her chores, and hummed the same simple lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. Elias, a man of few words, found his own way to reach the boy. He sat on the porch steps one afternoon, carving a piece of cottonwood with his knife. Leo watched from a distance, a tiny, wary shadow. Elias didn't look at him. He just carved, the wood shavings falling at his feet, until a small, rough-hewn horse, much like the iron one that still sat on the mantelpiece, took shape in his hands. He set it on the step beside him and went inside. A few minutes later, when he looked out, the boy was gone, and so was the horse. The silence was broken one morning a month later. Ada was standing at her window, watching the sunrise paint the sky, when Leo came to stand beside her. He pointed a small, grubby finger toward the horizon. "Pink," he whispered, his voice a rusty, unused thing. Ada's heart seized in her chest. She knelt down beside him. "Yes," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "It's pink, and soon it will be gold." From that day on, the cabin was filled with a new kind of life, the sound of a child's tentative questions, the scuff of small boots on the floorboards, and eventually, the bright, startling sound of his laughter. Elias taught him how to track rabbits and how to tell the difference between a hawk and an eagle. Ada taught him how to knead bread, his small hands clumsy but earnest in the floury dough. He was their son, not of blood, but of a deeper bond, a weaving together of 3 broken threads into a cord that was strong and true. One evening, a year to the day after the inquest, Ada stood at her window. The sun was setting, bleeding a spectacular palette of crimson and violet across the western sky, throwing the long, dark shadows of the mesas across the land. The air was cool, smelling of dust and the faint, sweet scent of the beans cooking on the hearth. Outside, she could see Leo, a small, sturdy figure, carefully watering the cornstalks with a small bucket Elias had made for him. He was talking to the plants, a low, serious monologue, his face intent. A smile touched her lips. She felt a familiar warmth behind her and leaned back as Elias wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was solid, real, his presence a constant, reassuring anchor in her world. They stood there in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the last of the sun's fire disappear below the horizon. The sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars began to prick the darkness. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, warm rumble against her ear. "Still think the cabin was empty?" The question was a gentle echo from a lifetime away, a reminder of the terrified, half-wild woman she had been, a woman who had seen only an empty shell, a place to hide. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the storms weathered, both outside and in, the blood shed, the tears wept, the love that had taken root in this hard, unforgiving ground. She looked out at the peaceful twilight, at the small boy who was their son, at the land that was their home. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against his, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with a certainty that was as deep and vast as the darkening sky. "I think it was waiting for us. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. We'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and show your support by pressing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners."